Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Books and Strikes. Books and Strikes is a show where we discuss books on baseball, and sometimes we take the cameras out on the road to see what's happening regarding baseball in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Today we're discussing a book on baseball and economics. The book is called Public Dollars, Private Stadiums, The Battle Over Building Sports Stadiums, written by Kevin Delaney and Rick Eckstein. Delaney is on the faculty at Temple University in Philadelphia, and Eckstein is on the faculty at Villanova University, which is right outside of Philadelphia. Now, joining me on the show today is Eric Click. Eric is at Park University, which is in Kansas City, where he is program coordinator of public administration. Eric is also an undergraduate graduate from Lindenwood University, where he studied under me. So one of a number of my students who subsequently went on to receive a Ph.D. or are currently working on a Ph.D. In your case, you got it from University of Texas at Dallas. In public policy analysis, if I remember.
Public affairs.
Public affairs.
Close enough.
There's always that interrelationship. Schools call them all types of things. So,
umbrella term.
It's nice to have students on who received the PhD, and like having that.
It's good to be back.
And your doctorate dissertation was on the theme, essentially, of this book, which was dealing with economic development and the building of a baseball stadium.
Right, the impact of the growth machine on publicly financing sports facilities, the case of the St. Louis Cardinals.
Now, that's sort of a theme of this book, which is one of the reasons why we're also talking about it. The book is addressing sort of a generalization for the audience listening. We're looking at different cities, such as Cleveland and Cincinnati. We're looking at Minneapolis. We're looking at Hartford, just to give an example of cities that have things called a growth machine, or what you might call a coalition that wants to support the building of stadiums. And the book is trying to show you good examples and bad examples, cities where this growth machine that supports the creation of the building of stadiums is strong, and so can sort of get it through, and other places where it sort of is weak and we don't see it quite do as well, but in some cases they may still get a stadium. We'll get to maybe the Metrodome up and down falling in Minneapolis as an example. So they're laying out, for example, where you see around the country the idea of this coming together of usually business interests within a city that like to push for the idea of creating a new sports stadium. It doesn't matter whether it's baseball or football or basketball. Those are the three more or less examples they're going through in this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've talked about this some in the past, but the growth machine in itself, growth machine theory, basically says elite actors, such as those in the sports worlds, business interests, the media, they combine, well, of course politicians, they combine in the name of growth to generally trade their monetary gains for the rest of our societal gains. Now, the author is very careful to point out that he went with local growth coalition theory, which is more between what he terms businesses, local businesses, and also local governments, because the machine itself, to him, is a little bit extreme. Yeah. And that there are these particular cases based upon where you're at. So that leads us to these individual cases where he takes a look at how these elite actors and these interests and these individual societal differences interact.
One of the interesting features you certainly get a feel for the book is a couple of things that just stand out in my mind. Is first off, when new stadiums are proposed, whatever dollar figure they come up with is usually outrageously wrong. And you see quotations through the book, oh, we just threw that number out, you know, and then they took it as face value, and it's like nobody then wants to take responsibility for correcting the idea, saying so you have these incredible cost overruns. And so you see that. Another sort of thing is almost the anti-democratic process. It's like to remove the voters because after the voters get ticked off and maybe vote down a referendum and won't vote a sales tax increase or a parking lot fee increase or a fee on a hotel, any fees that can be used, because you're coming up with a variety of imaginative ways you can try to increase taxes. And once these things get voted down, then you got to figure out, well, okay, that didn't count. We don't care about what the voters said. We're still going ahead with it. If you're in a strong growth coalition city, we're just going to bypass them and go do whatever the hell we want anyway.
Right, and the authors make a good point. Both the authors are actually sociologists by trade, so they tend to really want to look at it from the democratic process. In particular, they do a chapter at the end that talks all about the ramifications. And in essence, what they say is more or less what you said, which is no matter what, these stadiums are going to happen pretty much. And if you look at actually the majority of the cases, even if they didn't happen in this particular book, if you look further into the future, most of these did eventually happen outside of say Hartford with the Patriots, but actually even Hartford eventually did get the University of Connecticut to build a football stadium there. So more or less it's that idea of representative government against direct democracy. And what these people basically say is, no matter what, people pretty much don't know what they're talking about, and they do. And in order to get this done, seemingly they do virtually anything, and some of it actually criminal, which you've seen in some of the cases. So there are some large-scale ramifications for that sort of behavior relative to the democratic process.
Well, certainly what is not explained clearly, and that you have to go through the book to understand. I had to reread sections, but I've had to do this with previous books you and I have also discussed. This has got to be our 5th, 6th, 7th book we've discussed on sports and economic development, is the owners make out like bandits. Everybody else gets shafted.
They do,
yeah.
and that was a recurring theme in there. If you really notice, now the authors are somewhat forgiving in the fact that they say, hey, look, what do you expect? They're owners. But what's really disturbing to the author is, of course, even to a certain extent, the business interests are going to drive their interests. But the politicians, the elected and the non-elected officials, seemingly just go along. And in some of these places, they've pretty much rubber stamped it. And we all know, no matter what, ultimately, if this is public finance, no one can really give money out unless you are the politicians and the public officials.
Well, certainly I like the section on building the Cavalier Stadium. And you end up having the brothers that are the owners of the team. They're saying, well, we got our stadium over here, and the stadium is fine. It's just outside of Cleveland, and we're going to lose all this revenue because we're getting the revenue now from the parking spaces. Now we're going to move over here, and you want the revenue. To heck with that. You're giving all the revenue to us, and what we don't give to you, you're going to create as a tax credit program. And as a result, it's like we've already paid bills, but we're not going to pay it, but instead we're getting the money. And you sit there, and the only reason also I bring that up is because then they get these incredible clauses inserted into the contract, and the contract clauses say something as vague as this will be a first-rate facility. And I'm thinking, what? Well, who's determining that? Who's making this? Oh, yeah, otherwise they're not signing a contract unless we give them this clause that says it's a first-rate facility. It's going to be the best, the brightest, the best. You know, you're sitting there going, that's what you're putting in a contract? You know?
No, these are very dangerous clauses, and these clauses have been popping up in the last 10 to 15 years or so. We've talked about in previous episodes, we'll talk about in future episodes. The Rams have a similar sort of clause, and when you start to try to interpret these clauses, it becomes very dangerous. What was interesting with the Cavaliers is they interpreted that as not as a first-rate facility, but also this table. Is this a first-rate or better than any other table in my luxury box? So they started doing that with every single thing. And again, that can become very dangerous. And what it also shows is, in general, when these politicians leave it to either the sports teams or they leave it to the business interest, quite frankly, these people are better at this than the politicians. So there has to be more oversight and more involvement.
Now, another certainly feature of the book is, now these two, the authors, they went around, they obviously interviewed lots of people because the book is filled with quotations. I like one of them where they're talking with a local member of a growth coalition in Cincinnati, and he's going, yeah, we didn't care about the vote. Now we're going to get what we want anyway. And so then the next day they're over talking with someone else who's a member of this growth coalition, and he gets a phone call from the guy they spoke with the day before, and you get the impression, he said, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said it that way, and he said, I'm going to alert this guy to say something more diplomatic, you know, more vaguely stated, which is the way most politicians like to say things. You ask them time of day and they won't tell you the precise answer. So you're having that from these people, and they're doing the same thing, where you're getting this incredible vagueness, and so then you're listening to this sort of interaction, and I'm getting what I want.
You know, and especially now, this book was written in 2003. If anything, these sort of concerns have increased, obviously, with the bailout, obviously with the different movements like Occupy Wall Street and so forth. While the authors never come out and say it, and again, people tend to say quite often that there's conspiracy. Well, while there may not be a conspiracy, it's hard to say that there's not if that kind of behavior is going on. And obviously, I often say is without transparency, you have conspiracy. And clearly, at the heart of this is a lack of transparency to really virtually anyone who's involved that's not within the interest of these coalitions.
And one of the things that he's pointing out there is the fact that a lot of media is sometimes a part of this growth coalition, so that you're having a conflict between owners and reporters, or editors and reporters. So he's referring in there to the conflict that exists within TV stations or newspapers in different cities, and that you're having the editors, the owners, they decided they want it and they want to be part of it, but the reporters over here are in conflict, saying, well, listen, we got to challenge some of this data and reasoning that is being presented, and we got to sort of look at, wait a second, where's this money coming from? How much is it actually going to cost? Is it really going to add to the benefit of the city? I mean, most of these statements are always being made by these people saying, we need this because it's good for economic development, and then the implication is sometimes job creation. None of that appears to be really true. Most of it is a substitution. You eliminate these jobs, you add those jobs, so you in the end end up with basically the same amount of jobs you had before. But now you're looking at how much public dollars were needed to create those newly created jobs that are replacing the old jobs.
Right. And what's interesting in here is they do distinguish between two different arguments. A lot of places have what they call Plan A and a Plan B, which a Plan A is to argue the economics. Now, in general, virtually everyone nowadays, especially even 10 years later, recognizes that this does not bring these large-scale economic effects. And we've talked about that sort of issue where primarily it's a substitution effect. This book does a good job of saying even beyond the substitution effect, which is just obviously moving wealth from one area to another or jobs from one area to another, is that this could actually hurt you, which some books have covered. But they talk about things like, if you have a stadium and you have auxiliary businesses that even develop, well, those are only businesses related to sports. So they could be sports bars, things like that, but the problem is they only do well when the stadium is in session. Opposed to if you had local restaurants or local regular businesses where some actually, for example in Philadelphia, said we don't want you to move into our downtown. We're doing well enough that if you do move in, you'll actually hurt those roots in those areas. And then moving then beyond the economics, what they try to say is, well, and I really like this term, I haven't seen this anywhere else, called community self-esteem. That you talk about the esteem of the community, and that's particularly easier to push in older cities, particularly Midwestern cities, where they've had a decline. So you push the major league, the reputation. You don't want to be like these other small cities. If you're St. Louis, of course, you don't want to be like Kansas City, even though Kansas City don't want to be, doesn't want to be like St. Louis. So you kind of use that. Or if you're in Cincinnati, you don't want to be like a Dayton or an Akron. So you push that ideology to say that, hey, we are major league, and in order to be major league, or in order to be that kind of status, then we need to continue to have major league sports.
When they use that terminology, because that was interesting, how in interviewing these people, when I'm looking at what they're talking about in Cincinnati and Cleveland, just to use those two examples, because he went through them in depth in the book, they're both saying, well, we want major league status. And you're going, okay, what does that mean in English? Well, according to the Growth Coalition members, who are usually CEOs of different companies, What it means is their ability to recruit talent to work for their company. And the way they can recruit talent is to say, hey, we got skyboxes, we got stadium boxes for you, come to Cincinnati and Cleveland, which is an oddity. It's not sort of enhancing the city's reputation, it's enhancing their ability to recruit for their business.
Again, it comes back to it's then their self-interest, and what's often argued is through the growth machine or these local coalitions is that these self-interests are still then in the greater self-interest of the rest of the population, which just isn't the case. And what they do a good job of making the point of is that this idea that local businesses now that you still have them, that they're connected to the city, particularly these Midwestern cities, you see this in St. Louis even, isn't the case anymore. Even if you have an Anheuser-Busch, they've been bought out. Okay, these aren't the same roots. And they make a good point of saying, hey, while these guys will promote this kind of stuff, the reality of it is they have no real connection to the city. So they're professional headhunters. So while this may, again, be in their interest, the real problem is they're not getting generally employees from the local area. And then you don't have issues like public education or mass transit taken into account. And then they say this basically the downtowns become a playground for suburbanites. So they come down, they have their play, and then they leave. But the reality of it is everyone who lives in the city has to deal with the repercussions.
Yeah, it is a good book. And it's the sort of book, I guess, because in a future show we'll do with the issue of the St. Louis Rams and whatever's going to happen there. Again, another thing about the price tag and what exactly is, yes, again, these early stages, you're going, yeah, right. But this is the sort of thing that you would like to have more of a public discussion on, and it's difficult to completely do it. But I noticed that one section of the book, in other words, they talk about the idea that a lot of the members of these growth coalitions couldn't give a hoot about education, public education. And a whole discussion, and with some of them were quotations, it's like, what do I care? You know? So the idea of, we use, it's almost like, oh yeah, I'm concerned about education too, but it's not true.
Well, and that's ultimately concerning because, again, these are the public officials. And if the public officials are not watching out for what's in the best interest of the population, then the authors make a good point, then who is? So it's seemingly what's somewhat disturbing about this and each individual case is that this has grown into the greater culture of these cities or society, and where they don't really think about these ramifications or think about alternatives, that this has almost been ingrained into their everyday life, everyday policy decision makings to make these sort of actual decisions. I look at something in my dissertation called, when I come up with the growth machine network theory. And what I look at is, while these guys really talk about the businesses, which I think maybe in 2003 was more of the case, being the driver, the reality of it is I look at the catalyst as the sports teams, which I kind of make mention. As soon as the sports teams say something, everyone else kind of jumps into action because they don't want the sports teams to generally take the lead. Ultimately, while the businesses are key players, more and more businesses are being eroded, the public officials are the drivers. Because again, this doesn't happen unless the public officials lets it. Because you cannot release money unless the public officials are involved. And more, as you notice too, these isn't just local involvement. This is a whole state issue, that the states are getting involved, and a lot of this money is coming from the state down. So this is a whole culture within the states and arguably within the U.S.
We only have a few minutes left. My recommendation, if you're listening to this is a good book. It's a little bit on the academic side, but they do a good job because of the incredible amount of interviews they do, and you get a real feeling. And again, if St. Louis is going to be thinking about something regarding the Rams, you have references made in there, for example, that it's easier for a football team to pick up and move out of town than it is for a baseball team. So, that threat of where the Rams may or may not want to go hangs over the head of St. Louis. And again, it's the issue of prestige as opposed to economic development.
Right, and the book does a good job to point out that the NFL and MLB are very prone to talk about even new stadiums outright, to give things like Super Bowls, All-Star games, to allow movement based upon new stadiums. And the reality of it is, when you look at these sort of issues, it's very important to take these things into account.
Good book. We'd both recommend you want to read this if you're interested in known something about how to put the St. Louis Rams football stadium, whatever, into a broader perspective. So thanks for joining us today.